Here is the sew-along for the 951 Palazzo trousers pattern. Members can download it and you can also buy it. Part 1, Fabric Choice. The fabric is from Croft Mill. What a glorious colour! Croft Mill will match lining and thread for you. This fabric I already have. What a perfect match for a shirt. So back to the pattern. Use the same pattern pieces for the lining. The differences in the lining are marked in red. You will need to reattach this section when you cut out the lining. Also note the lining crotch is a little higher and the leg is shorter. Pre-wash fabric and lining before cutting out. Fabric and lining are cut out and markings transferred. What to do if, like me, you forget to tape back the lining section? Fortunately, it's easy to stitch back on at this stage. You will need to cut out the section separately and join it to the lining. Make sure you add on seam allowance correctly for this piece. Iron interfacing to the wrong side of the waistband. Mark the dots carefully on the welt interfacing and iron onto the welts matching the dots. Remove the tailor tacks from the welt pieces. Follow the interactive PDF for help with sewing skills. We are ready to stitch the back darts and then work on the welt pockets. Pin and baste darts or stitch them straight off. This bubble wash corduroy is easy to work with. It's a great option for beginners. Stitch straight off the point, leaving a long thread and knot. Remove tailor tacks as you go along. This fabric looks good even before pressing. Press both darts towards the centre. Line up the dots and pin in position. We will stitch along the parallel lines from dot to dot. The welt piece extends above the waistline. Some surplus is used up in the welt folds. The remainder is trimmed later. Start and stop exactly on the dots. We are cutting through just the welt. Try and keep to the middle. Then getting into the slit, cut through the trouser back, cutting through the darts. This time stop a ½ inch, 1.25 centimetres short of the dots. Then cut diagonally towards the dots. You'll have a triangle of fabric at the end. It's a little tricky, but this fabric is very easy to work with. It doesn't appear to fray too much. Visit my website for a more detailed tutorial on welt pockets. Turn the welt to the inside. The little triangles will be tucked out of the way. We will even up the edges during pressing. The sleeve board is very useful here. So press these narrow seams open as best you can. Then, folding like this, press in the fold of one side of the welt. Try and make the width around 3/16 of an inch, 0.5 centimetres. It's best to use a pressing cloth on the right side of this fabric. Press the other side in the same way. We will be stitching down the little triangles here, and then stitching in the ditch along here and here. So I am securing the little triangles. I use a zipper foot when I'm trying to get close up to an edge. Changing back to a normal foot, I'm stitching in the ditch. Then stitch a bar tack at each end. I used a zigzag stitch, length 0.7 and width 2. Complete the pocket by joining the pocket lining to the welt. And then add the under pocket. So matching notches, stitch the lining to the welt. Neaten the seam allowance and press down. With the under pocket pinned in place, machine from this side. Machine around the 3 edges. I have neatened the seam allowance. Next we need to seal off the top of the pocket by stitching along here. Then secure the layers at the waist by machining within the seam allowance. Trim away the surplus pocket fabric. back welt pockets are finished. Now for the front pockets. Baste stay tape to the wrong side of the fronts, along the seam line of the pocket opening. Pin the top pocket to the fronts, right sides together. Grade and clip the seam allowance. Turn right sides out and press. Baste to preserve the pressed edge. Position the under pocket right sides together, matching the notches. Stitch from the waist to the side seam. Neaten the edge of the pocket bag. Stitch across the top and at the sides, matching the edges. Note that the pocket is designed to bow out a little. Machine within the seam allowance to keep the layers in place. Backs and fronts are ready to be joined together. So first we will join the centre back and the centre front seams. Hold the pocket bag out of the way. Neaten both seams and press open. We are now ready to join the fronts to the backs. We start by sewing in the concealed zip. Always use a zip at least 2 inches 5 centimetres longer than the finished length. Measure down from the top of the teeth for sizes 6 to 12, 8 inches 20 centimetres. For sizes 14 to 22, 9 inches 23 centimetres. And mark clearly. Use my 4-run method. See my website for details. Use a zipper foot and start with needle to the right. Align the teeth with the seam line. This row secures the tape in position. Stop exactly at the mark. Then needle to the left. Stitch a second row up against the teeth, uncurling them as you go. Again, stop exactly at your mark. Place the other side of the zip in position. The needle is still to the left, and the teeth are along the seam line. Secure the tape in position as before. Again, stop at the mark. Now set needle to the right. Stitch the fourth row up against the teeth as before. So good so far. The zip is looking good. We will now complete the remainder of the seam. Match the notches and pin. The stitching line along the zip will be slightly inside the seam allowance. Start a little below the end of the zip stitching. Make sure your stitching below the zip is on the seam line. Now go back and complete the gap in the stitching. Change back to the zipper foot. Needle to the right. Line up with the stitching below the zip. It's worth taking the time to sew zips in carefully, as it makes all the difference to the finished garment. No lumps or bumps, even though this is quite bulky corduroy. Before you go any further, neaten the seam allowance and press the seam open below the zip. Cut off the surplus zip, leaving about 2 inches, 5 centimetres. We will then stitch the ends to the seam allowance. Use a zipper foot for this job. A nice neat finish. We can now stitch the other side seam. Pin matching notches and stitch. I have amended the pattern and reduced the width of the back pocket slightly so that they don't get in the way of the side seams. We can now stitch the inside leg seam. Pin matching notches and stitch. I have neatened this seam. Now for the front pleats. I marked the position with snips into the seam allowance. Here in size 12, the distance between the snips is about 1.5 inches, 4 centimetres. For size 22, it is about 2¼ inches, just under 6 centimetres. So the width of the pleat will be half. Line up carefully across the top. And make sure the pleat is straight. Pin and check the pleat width. Next, we will secure the pleat with stitching in the seam allowance. I'm using a zigzag stitch to hold the pleat securely. The pleats are nice and evenly balanced. So that is as far as we go with the main garment. We can now turn our attention to the lining. Firstly, we stitch the darts. Notice I have attached the section I mistakenly cut off. And I will also stitch the crotch seam a little higher by reducing the width of the seam allowance. Stitch all the darts in the 4 lining pieces in the same way and press towards the centre. Next, stitch the centre front and back seams. I have neatened the seam allowances, joined together and pressed to one side. Now complete the inside leg seams. Pin matching notches and stitch. Again, neaten the seam allowances together and press to one side. Next, we will join the side seams, leaving an opening for the zip. This is the lining front. The opening will be on this side. Measure down as before. For sizes 6 to 12, 8 inches, 20 centimetres, and for sizes 14 to 22, 9 inches, 23 centimetres, and mark with chalk. Neaten the seam allowance to just past the mark. Join the seam from the mark to the hem. Matching notches. Pin the other side seam. So, after machining these seams, neaten and press to one side. Now to attach the lining to the zip tape. We have a choice. Here is the first method. This is the back and this is the front. The lining is wrong side out. Join the lining front to the garment front and pin. Then match the lining back to the garment back and pin. We will then turn the lining through. I'm using the zipper foot again with the needle to the left. It's actually easier to do this without pinning. Stop at your mark. Stitch the other side. Turn through. If you find this method too difficult, it's just as good to hand stitch the lining to the zip tape. Hand stitch if you end up with a gap here. Next we will add the waistband. Pin the lining in place. Machine all the way around inside the seam allowance. Neaten the unnotched edge. The dots correspond to the left side seam, the centre front seam, the right side seam, the centre back seam, and the left side seam again. Machined all round from the waistband side to ensure an even width. I have pressed the seam allowance up. Now for the ends. The final width of the waistband is 1 inch, 2.5 centimetres. Fold in half, right sides together, and stitch. Do the same on the underlap end. Turn the corner and continue just short of the side seam. The ever useful zipper foot allows you to get close to the bulky layers. Alternatively, you could use a stitch compensator with the regular foot. Trim the ends and mitre the corners. Turn the ends through. Carefully push out the corners. Turn in a little of the seam allowance here. Pin the waistband in place all the way round, measuring as you go. Again, tuck in a little bit of the seam allowance at the end. Stitch in the ditch, removing pins as you go. Stitching in the ditch is easy on this fabric. The stitches are buried, even if you go a little off course. The waistband is looking very neat. And the zip lines up perfectly. To fasten, I'm using 2 hooks and hand-worked loops. If you don't know how to sew loops, take a look at one of my very early videos, Sewing the Sleeveless Top Part 3. A press stud keeps the underlap in place. Now for the hems. Neaten the lower edge, ready for blind hemming. For the lining, trim, then turn up a ½ inch, 1 centimetre, all round and press. We will pin a 1 inch, 2.5 centimetre turning and machine along the fold. So pin up, measuring as you go. You could blind hem this if preferred. Press the lining hem. Trim the seam allowance to the hemline so there is less bulk at the seams. Measure and pin up the 1½ inch, 4 centimetre hem. I like to baste before blind hemming so that I don't need to machine over pins, which is very much frowned upon these days. Always test blind hem stitch on a spare piece of fabric to check visibility on the right side. The stitch hardly shows on this type of fabric. The Palazzo trousers are finished and have had a final press. This fabric has been a great success. I hope you've enjoyed watching me make this pattern. Members can download it, or you can buy it from my website angelakane.com. So subscribe to this channel to keep up to date with new patterns and sew-alongs. I would love to have your feedback on my sew-alongs. Is this one too long or too speeded up? Should it be split into separate parts the way I used to do them? Follow my Design Notebook blog post to see what I'm planning next. I think it has got to be a shirt using this fabric I've had for so many years. Join my website for all patterns, sewing ebooks and more tutorials. Thank you so much for watching.